In the opulent yet unforgiving world of Gilded Age Philadelphia, a woman of wealth and whispers dares to make a scandalous choice. Genevieve Sinclair, widowed and watched by every eye in society, offers marriage to a man stripped of fortune and pride. Edward Hale accepts, but with one vow: he will never touch her. What begins as a cold bargain soon trembles with secrets waiting to break free, with pride battling against longing, and with a question that cannot be silenced. Can love be born from an arrangement built on silence? Tell me, where are you listening from? And do you believe the greatest romances are chosen or destined? Philadelphia, winter of 1873. The city was cloaked in grey fog and quiet apprehension, its grand avenues echoing the tremors of the financial panic that had rippled through banks and households alike. But inside the rose-gold salon of Mrs. Helena Mercer's townhouse on Rittenhouse Square, the tone was brisk, the laughter artificial, and the glances sharp-edged as knives. Genevieve Sinclair stood at the edge of the crowd, her gloved hands resting lightly on the back of a velvet-upholstered chair, her figure as composed as a marble statue. At 36 years of age, she was still the embodiment of poised elegance. Her gown, a deep garnet silk trimmed with black chantilly lace, fit her like memory fit grief, perfectly, but with weight. Her hair, coiled at the nape with silver pins, framed her pale face in soft waves that refused to betray her age. But it was her eyes, those calm, grey-blue eyes, that held the attention of every woman who envied her and every man who feared her. They whispered that her fortune was waning, that her late husband had left more illusion than stability, that the estate on Walnut Street was beautiful but hollow. And Genevieve, who heard everything while pretending to hear nothing, let the rumors settle like dust at her feet. She had come to the gathering not for company, but for calculation. Across the room, leaning with forced ease against the marble fireplace, stood Edward Hale. He was 3 years her junior, yet life had carved sharper lines across his face than time alone could explain. His once pristine reputation as the heir to the Hale name had crumbled with the collapse of their family's investments. Yet even stripped of fortune, he retained the posture of old breeding, broad shoulders beneath a well-cut but dated frock coat, a cravat tied with care, though the cuffs of his shirt were beginning to fray. Genevieve watched him with interest, not pity. There was something in the way he adjusted his stance every time someone passed him, in the way his eyes scanned the room not for pleasure but for escape. A man like that did not want to be seen, he needed to be rescued, though he'd sooner choke on his own pride than admit it. Their eyes met once, briefly. His gaze was unreadable, hers, practiced indifference. Later that evening, on the second-floor balcony, where the city lights flickered through the gauze of evening snow, she found him alone, staring out into the night, with his gloved hands clenched behind his back. "Mr. Hale," she said with the tone of one not used to being ignored. He turned slowly, his expression tight. "Mrs. Sinclair." They stood in silence, the hush between them thick with unsaid truths. "I believe," she began softly, "that we may be of use to one another." He arched an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Genevieve did not smile. She never bartered with charm. "I require a husband, one whose name will silence certain tongues and whose presence will preserve certain rights." He inhaled, but said nothing. "You require stability, a home for your sister, protection from vultures wearing cufflinks." His jaw tensed. "You presume much." "I presume only what I know." She paused. "I would ask for no affection, only appearances." His voice was bitter when it came. "You wish to buy a husband?" "No," she said. "I wish to purchase peace." He turned toward her then, the light from the drawing room casting a soft glow on his cheekbones and jawline. He looked almost handsome in that moment, if one ignored the tight coil of wounded pride that seemed to live in his chest. "And in return," he asked, "you would have protection, dignity, and your own room." There was a flicker in his eyes, relief perhaps, or disappointment. He gave a soft laugh. One without joy. I see. Very well, then. He looked away, then back at her. But let us be clear, Mrs. Sinclair. You may have my name. You may have my presence. But you will never have my touch. Genevieve's gaze did not falter. Then we understand one another perfectly. Far below, a carriage clattered past on the frozen street, its sound muffled by snow and distance. Two souls, equally bruised by the world, stood facing one another not as lovers, nor even as friends, but as strangers striking a bargain written in silence, pride, and shadows. Neither knew then that what they sealed that night would unravel everything they believed unshakable. But for now, there were no revelations. Only two gloved hands parting without so much as a brush of skin, and the cold wind of a Philadelphia winter that refused to soften, even for the wealthy. The morning of the wedding dawned with a sky the color of tarnished silver. Snow had begun to fall over Philadelphia in soft, deliberate flakes, like nature itself wished to shroud the day in hush. Behind the tall, wrought-iron gates of the Sinclair estate, preparations had been underway since before dawn. Servants moved swiftly but in silence, as if afraid to awaken the ghosts that lived within the marble walls. The ceremony was set to take place in the Winter Salon, a grand hall on the north wing of the mansion, rarely used since the death of Mr. Sinclair. It was a room of mirrors and marble, of pale grey columns and soaring windows veiled in sheer muslin. Chandeliers sparkled under the grey light, their crystals trembling with each step upon the parquet floor. A fire crackled in the hearth, not for warmth, but to soften the frost of tension that hung in the air. Genevieve stood in her chambers as the final pins were placed in her hair. She wore no veil. Her gown, crafted in muted lavender silk, whispered as she moved. A colour chosen carefully, neither the jubilant ivory of a new bride, nor the sombre black of mourning. The bodice was modest, trimmed in black lace, the sleeves long and fitted to her slender wrists. Her only ornament was a brooch at her collar, an opal surrounded by small pearls, a gift from her late mother. She gazed at herself in the mirror with a detachment that bordered on cruelty. This was not the face of a woman in love. It was the face of a woman fulfilling a contract, a woman who had learned that appearances were not only armor, they were currency. A soft knock at the door. Her maid, Ruth, stepped in. "They're waiting, ma'am." Genevieve nodded once, then turned away from her reflection. She descended the grand staircase alone. The guests had arrived precisely at 11. Philadelphia's elite, bankers and their wives, factory owners, widows of old names, politicians with polished shoes and polished lies, filled the room like vultures draped in velvet. Their murmurs were low but steady, the kind of whispers that clung to walls and followed people home. There was no music, no procession. Only the shuffle of silk and the sharp scent of winter roses arranged in crystal vases. The minister stood beneath a tall, arched window, a Bible in hand, his expression tight and proper. Edward was already there. He stood tall, his posture impeccable, his jaw clenched so tightly one could see the tension in his temples. He wore a charcoal grey frock coat, his waistcoat black, his cravat tied with exacting precision. But his eyes, they were hard, distant. There was no joy in them, only resolve. He did not look at her as she crossed the room. He did not offer his hand. The ceremony was brief. The vows were spoken clearly, without falter, yet without warmth. The minister asked if they took one another in lawful matrimony, and they answered yes. Genevieve with steady eyes, Edward with a voice like stone. There was no kiss, only a final prayer. As the minister closed his book, applause did not follow. A few polite coughs, the rustle of skirts, and the clink of a dropped fan filled the space that should have held celebration. A woman in green whispered too loudly, "Well, I suppose that's one way to keep a roof over your head." Genevieve turned her head just slightly toward the voice. One look, icy and unblinking, and the woman lowered her eyes, shamed into silence. After the guests were ushered out for brandy and cake, The bride and groom did not linger. They retreated separately, with the quiet choreography of two strangers boarding the same train. That night, the house remained hushed. No music played. The ballroom remained unlit. The staff moved cautiously, as if the walls themselves might disapprove of merriment. Genevieve entered her private sitting room shortly after 8. A tray had been placed by the hearth, tea untouched. The fire burned low. On the mantel stood a porcelain clock that had once belonged to her grandmother. Its ticking filled the space with solemn rhythm. A soft knock. She turned. Edward stood in the doorway, his coat removed, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he stepped inside, crossed the room, and placed something on the small table beside the fireplace, his wedding band. "I will not wear it," he said, his voice calm, measured. It would be a lie. She did not flinch. She walked over, picked up the ring, studied it. "As you wish," she replied softly. He looked at her then, truly looked, his eyes scanning her face, her hands, the silver in her hairline that caught the firelight, not with desire, but with something bordering on regret. "I will keep to my word, Mrs. Sinclair." "I never doubted you, Mr. Hale." A silence. Then he bowed his head slightly, turned, and left. That night, Genevieve lay in her bed alone. The covers remained smooth on the side he would never occupy. Outside, the snow fell heavier. Inside, the only sound was the wind pressing against the windows like some forgotten spirit begging to be let in. In the morning, sunlight filtered through the lace curtains. The city awoke under a blanket of white. Genevieve, dressed in a soft grey morning gown with a high collar and delicate buttons down the front, descended the stairs to the breakfast room. She sipped tea alone, unread correspondence laid out before her, untouched. Just past 10, Helena Mercer arrived. She did not wait to be announced. She swept into the room with the air of a woman too old for games and too influential to be denied. Her gown, dark burgundy with black trim, rustled with determination. Genevieve did not rise. She merely motioned toward the chair opposite her. Helena sat. Her eyes, the color of faded ink, studied the young widow-turned-wife. "So," she began, voice low and cutting, "you did it." Genevieve met her gaze without blinking. "Yes." Helena leaned forward, one gloved hand resting on the tablecloth. "Do you know what they're saying?" Genevieve folded her hands calmly in her lap. "I rarely concern myself with the opinions of the bored and irrelevant." Helena smirked. "They say you bought yourself a husband, that you made him sign away his dignity in exchange for your name and your roof." Genevieve tilted her head. "Did they also say he came willingly?" "They always come willingly," Helena replied with a bitter chuckle. "Until they resent the cage." Genevieve said nothing. Helena's tone softened just slightly. "I knew your mother. She was a woman of ferocious pride, but she understood one thing better than most. This city does not forgive ambition in women, unless it's hidden behind lace and smiles." Genevieve stood. She moved to the window and looked out over the garden, now blanketed in snow. "My mother wore lace," she said quietly, "and died with regret." Helena remained seated, watching her. "Be careful, Genevieve. You've placed a man beneath your roof who will never forget that you rescued him. That sort of debt, it eats at a man's spine." Genevieve turned. "I did not rescue him, Helena. I offered him a bargain. Whether he chooses to see it as a favor or a chain is not my concern." Helena nodded slowly, then rose to leave. As she reached the doorway, she paused. Marriages built on silence have a way of turning into tombs. When the door closed behind her, Genevieve remained by the window, her fingers resting on the cool glass. Outside, the snow continued to fall, quiet, cold, and relentless. Inside, the new Mrs. Hale stood still, draped not in white nor in black, but in the color of things left unsaid. In the early days of their union, the great Sinclair mansion seemed to grow quieter with each passing hour. Its ornate rooms, once pulsing with the occasional murmur of visitors, or the soft harmony of piano chords drifting from Genevieve's salon, now echoed with an unfamiliar stillness. A stillness not of peace, but of polite avoidance. Edward Hale, newly installed as master of a house he did not build and bound to a woman he did not choose, moved through the halls like a guest who had overstayed his welcome. He was careful, courteous, and impossibly distant. The staff, trained to regard the new husband with the same respect owed to his wife, obeyed him without warmth. Their deference was mechanical, not loyal. They saw in him what society saw, a man purchased, a man surviving on borrowed pride. Genevieve, for her part, made no demands. She did not call for him during the day, nor seek his company at night. At dinner, which they shared more out of custom than desire, she would sit across from him in the formal dining room, her posture impeccable, her voice low and deliberate. Conversations, when they occurred, revolved around neutral topics: the weather, charitable events, minor news from the mills. On the third evening, as a servant poured Bordeaux into cut-glass goblets, Edward finally asked, without looking at her, "Will your name remain Sinclair in public affairs?" Genevieve dabbed the corners of her mouth with her linen napkin before responding. "For business purposes, yes. The Hale name is not associated with industry. It would raise questions." He nodded once, then returned to his plate. It was like that, every word measured, every glance avoided. The space between them was a garden of silence, carefully tended, and neither dared trample it. But despite the stiffness of their arrangement, small cracks began to appear in Edward's armor. Clara, his younger sister, had moved into the East Wing days after the wedding. At 20 years of age, she carried the fragility of someone raised with gentleness and then thrust into uncertainty. Genevieve had offered her a room, a lady's maid, and access to her private library, all without ceremony. One afternoon, Edward found Clara in the conservatory, curled on a window seat with a book in her lap and tears in her eyes. He crouched beside her, frowning. "Has someone upset you?" She shook her head. "No, that's just it." "What do you mean?" "She treats me with kindness, not affection, but respect. I expected coldness or pity. Not this." Her voice faltered. "I don't know how to be grateful without feeling like I've betrayed Mother." Edward looked away, jaw tightening. "This is not a matter of betrayal." "Isn't it?" she whispered. "We live in her house. We wear her food. And you, Edward, what are you becoming in this place?" He rose abruptly, unable to answer. That night, Genevieve found a note tucked among her papers in the study. It was unsigned, but she recognized Clara's hand. It read simply, "Thank you for your dignity." She folded the paper in silence, slid it into a drawer, and said nothing of it again. Several days later, Edward ventured into the city for a meeting he had not planned, nor desired. He met Charles Whitman at a private room above the Merchants' Club, a richly appointed den of dark wood, cigars, and corruption cloaked in respectability. Whitman greeted him with a smirk that did not reach his eyes. "Well, well, the groom emerges." Edward said nothing as he sat, refusing the offered drink. Whitman leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You're not the first man to marry for survival, Edward, but you may be the first to look so damned miserable doing it. Get to the point." "Very well." He slid a folded document across the table. "I can have your family's remaining debts cleared in less than 2 weeks, your name restored, your father's grave no longer shadowed by disgrace. All I ask is access." Edward's eyes narrowed. "Access to what? To the ledgers? To the board meetings? Genevieve Sinclair may wear the widow's silk, but she holds an empire in her hands, and empires, my dear friend, are ripe for dismantling." Edward's hands curled into fists. "You want me to spy on my wife?" "Wife?" Whitman scoffed. "Let's not pretend there's affection in your arrangement. She bought your silence. I'm offering you your legacy." Edward stood slowly, the muscles in his neck taut. "I'd rather rot in shame than serve you." Whitman didn't blink. "Don't be so dramatic. Pride never paid a bill. Edward left the room without another word, the air behind him thick with smoke and threat. But what he did not know, what neither of them knew, was that Genevieve had been at the Merchants' Club that very hour. She had met with a retired mill overseer in a different parlour, discussing possible reforms in her factory lines. And as she crossed the hall to retrieve her gloves, she passed near enough to the private room to hear Whitman's voice. Not his words, only the tone. Mocking, entitled, familiar. She paused. She knew that voice. She knew its shape in her bones. And then she heard Edward. Not his words either, just the rhythm of his voice, low and firm. And then a chair scraping the floor. Footsteps. She slipped down the servant's stair and left through the side entrance, her gloves forgotten. That evening Edward returned later than usual. He looked tired, pale beneath the sharp line of his cheekbones. He did not come to dinner. Genevieve, dressed in a pale blue tea gown, dined alone under the crystal light of the dining-room chandelier. She took her soup in silence, her gaze fixed on the empty chair across from her. When she returned to her sitting room, she found a single rose resting on the writing desk. It was ivory, barely open, its petals tinged with frost from the evening air. There was no note. She did not touch it. Instead, she sat before the fire and opened her ledger book, but the numbers blurred before her eyes. She could still hear his voice, not the words, only the tone, and that was enough to awaken doubt. In the great halls of power and propriety, silence was more dangerous than lies, and trust, once splintered, did not easily return. The sky over the Schuylkill River hung heavy with ash-coloured clouds, mirroring the smoke that curled from the brick chimneys of the Sinclair textile mill. The hum of machinery pulsed through the narrow alleys, and the acrid scent of grease, wool, and fatigue clung to the stone walls like a second skin. It was late morning when Genevieve Sinclair stepped down from the black carriage, her gloved hand resting briefly on the driver's arm before she moved forward with silent determination. She wore a walking suit of slate grey, cut with sharp precision, the skirt trimmed with velvet piping, and the matching jacket fastened with jet buttons. A dark hat veiled her face just enough to shield her from both soot and scrutiny. Her presence drew eyes from every corner of the yard. Labourers paused mid-lift, foremen stiffened, and even the cold December air seemed to shift in deference. It was not customary for women of her class to visit the factories themselves. Supervisors were paid to handle such matters, but Genevieve had never cared for custom when it came wrapped in the language of avoidance. She walked through the gates of the mill not as a lady but as an owner. Inside, the noise was thunderous. Rows of women hunched over looms, their fingers quick, their faces pale under the dim gaslight. The clatter of machines roared like an angry sea, drowning any sense of civility. A girl, no older than 12, winced as her hand was caught in a shuttle. No one stopped, no one noticed, until Genevieve did. She crossed the floor in swift strides, her boots echoing over the iron-grated walkways. The overseer, a man with a stained vest and the breath of stale whiskey, reached the girl just as Genevieve arrived. "She's fine," he muttered, grabbing the child's arm roughly. "She can keep working." "Release her," Genevieve said, her voice low but ironclad. The man blinked. "Beg pardon, ma'am. I said release her." Her gloved hand went to the girl's wrist, gently pulling her away. The child's fingers were bleeding, her eyes wide with unshed tears. The overseer bristled. "She's not hurt bad. These things happen to children." Genevieve turned slowly, her gaze cutting through him like glass. "What kind of place are you running here?" The man opened his mouth, but she raised her hand. "You are dismissed. Effective immediately." "You can't." "I can," she said, "and I have." A silence fell over the floor. Even the machines seemed to hesitate. The girl was led away by a matron, and Genevieve remained standing in the center of the room, composed, resolute. It was the first time anyone at the mill had seen the mistress, not just as a signature on paper, but as a force that could not be ignored. From the mezzanine, Edward watched everything. He had arrived moments earlier, sent by her office to ensure she had proper company. He had expected to find her politely observing from the carriage or walking the outer perimeter. He had not expected her to step into the belly of the machine itself and emerge stronger. He followed her silently back to the carriage as snow began to fall in slow, heavy flakes. "You handled yourself well," he said, once they were seated. The door closed. She turned her head slightly, a breath of steam rising between her lips. "I did what needed to be done." He studied her face. There was a quiet storm in her expression, but no gloating, no false righteousness. "You shouldn't have gone alone," he added. "I didn't ask for your concern." "It wasn't concern," he said. "It was observation." Their eyes met. For the briefest of moments, something shifted. That evening, the Sinclair household attended a private dinner at the home of Walter Henley, a financier of railroads and an old acquaintance of the late Mr. Sinclair. The rooms were warm, the chandeliers aglow, and the conversation tinged with the usual blend of flattery and ambition. Genevieve wore deep blue velvet, her shoulders draped in a shawl of fine black lace. Diamonds glittered modestly at her ears. Edward stood by her side, tailored and unreadable as always. The meal was served in 6 courses, and by the time brandied pears were placed on crystal dishes, the tone at the table had shifted from polite to pointed. Charles Whitman, seated diagonally from Genevieve, leaned forward with a condescending smile. "I hear you've taken a personal interest in your factories, Mrs. Hale," he said, his fork twirling slowly through the air. "Quite the endeavour for a woman. Must be exhausting." A murmur of amusement passed through a few guests, but most simply lowered their eyes. Genevieve raised her chin. "Not as exhausting as fixing the errors of negligent men." Whitman chuckled. "Forgive me, but one wonders if such excursions are meant to be productive or merely theatrical." Edward's chair creaked. Genevieve didn't speak. She didn't need to. Edward's voice rang out sharp and cold. "If you knew the first thing about management, Whitman, you'd know the difference between theatrics and leadership." The room fell still. Whitman blinked. "Pardon?" Edward turned his gaze to him, calm but unyielding. "You mock what you don't understand. She's more competent than half the men at this table, and more honest than all of them." A sharp silence followed. Genevieve said nothing, but beneath the table, her hand closed slowly around her napkin. Later, as guests wandered into the drawing room for port and quiet music, Edward stepped away, needing air. He found himself near a tall window, the pane cold against his palm. The snow outside had thickened, casting the city in soft white. He did not hear her approach until her voice reached him. "You didn't have to defend me." He turned. She stood at a distance, her expression unreadable. "I didn't do it for you," he said. "I did it because I despise men who mistake power for worth." She tilted her head. "Do you still believe I bought you?" "I believe," he said slowly, "that I sold myself." A pause. "I don't know which of us is more to blame for that." She stepped closer. Just one step. Just enough that he could see the light catching in her eyes. There was a tension there, not anger, not hostility, but something deeper, a charge neither of them fully understood. For a moment the room faded. The city beyond the glass disappeared. And all that remained was the space between them, too far for touch, too close for peace. He opened his mouth as if to say something else, but no words came. Instead, he turned and left the room. Genevieve remained, her hands resting on the curve of the piano, her breath shallow. The mask was beginning to slip, but neither of them knew yet whether it would reveal something human beneath, or something far more dangerous. By the first week of January, Philadelphia's snow had begun to turn to ash beneath the carriages of society. The grand avenues were coated in grey slush, and the air carried a chill that seeped not only through bone, but through reputation. In parlours lined with gilt mirrors and mahogany sideboards, there was a new sport among the elite, the dismantling of the Hale-Sinclair Union. It began with a small paragraph buried in the social column of the Evening Ledger. A quiet line, No names mentioned, only the suggestion that a recent marriage between an iron heiress and a fallen gentleman had all the makings of a theatrical farce. But by the second printing, it had a headline, "A Transaction in Toul," and by the end of the week, it had a name. They called it the Hale Sinclair Farce. Genevieve read the articles without flinching. Over breakfast, she would unfold the newspaper, her expression unchanging as she scanned each line. She never commented, never so much as sighed, but Edward could see the way her fingers tightened ever so slightly around the porcelain teacup, and he noticed that she began to wear darker colors during the day, steel blue, deep plum, charcoal, as if trying to erase herself into the walls. He said nothing, because what could he say? That he too read the columns, that he burned with shame not for the scandal itself, but for the lie that had become their marriage. The servants were quieter now. Even Ruth, Genevieve's loyal maid, moved more cautiously around Edward. He noticed how conversations would stop when he entered a room, how glances lingered longer than they should. And somewhere in the background, like a shadow cast across silk, was Charles Whitman. Unbeknownst to either of them, one of the footmen, Thomas, a young man eager to rise in the city, had begun reporting to Whitman. A misplaced letter here, a whispered observation there. Whitman paid well for whispers, and Thomas, who once folded Edward's coats with admiration, now watched the man with hawk-like precision. It was Thomas who planted the first seed of a rumor too cruel to be ignored. He had seen Edward, one stormy night, walking with Clara down the garden path, his hand on her shoulder, her expression distraught. A moment of sibling concern, nothing more. But to Whitman, it was fuel. The story was twisted, stretched, poisoned, until it reached the ears of a gossip columnist with a taste for scandal and a fondness for Whitman's patronage. Within days, the whispers grew louder. Not only had Genevieve bought her husband, they said, but now she had lost his affections to a younger woman under her own roof. The implication that Edward was involved in a shameful affair with his sister-in-law was vulgar, grotesque, and completely false. But truth mattered little when paired against a well-crafted scandal. The blow struck hardest at a luncheon hosted by the Women's Charitable Society, where Genevieve had sponsored an initiative to support working-class widows. Clara had accompanied her, dressed in a modest rose-colored gown with lace cuffs, her hair styled simply. She had never looked more demure, nor more hopeful. It was her first formal appearance since the wedding, and Genevieve had nodded her approval as they entered the tea room at the hotel. The event was attended by more than 40 ladies of society, but it was Mrs. Agatha Loring, sharp-tongued and perpetually overdressed, who delivered the cut. As Clara reached for a sugar cube, Agatha leaned across the table and said, in a voice far too loud for civility, "It's so generous of Mrs. Hale to offer you shelter. One can only imagine the lengths to which some girls go to remain in such fine homes." Clara froze. Agatha smiled over her teacup. "I do hope your brother-in-law treats you with kindness." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dirty fire. Genevieve did not rise, she did not shout. She simply placed her spoon down with calm precision, turned toward Agatha, and said clearly, "If this is the kind of filth that passes for conversation in your home, Mrs. Loring, I understand now why your daughters remain unmarried." Gasps echoed around the table. One woman dropped her fan, another choked on her biscuit. Agatha turned crimson, her mouth twitching. Genevieve continued, voice steady. "Miss Hale is under my protection, and I assure you I do not extend that protection lightly." She rose, motioned for Clara, and walked out of the hotel with her chin high and her gloves immaculate. In the carriage ride home, Clara sat silently, tears brimming. "I didn't do anything," she whispered. "I know. But why would they say it?" "Because some women," Genevieve said, her voice softer now, "have nothing left but cruelty, and some men give them weapons." Clara said nothing, but she reached across the seat and, for the first time, took Genevieve's hand in hers. That night, the house felt heavier than usual. Snow began to fall again, dusting the tall windows with frost. Genevieve retired early. She removed her jewelry with practiced grace, her gestures mechanical. Ruth helped her undo the buttons at her back. A fire burned low in the hearth. Outside her door, the corridor was silent. But just as she reached to extinguish the lamp, she noticed something, a white rose. It lay at the threshold, delicate and trembling under the cold draught that slipped through the doorframe. Its petals were ivory, the stem wrapped in a ribbon of silver thread. No note, no knock, only that. Genevieve stood for a long moment, her hand still on the doorknob. Her heart, so long quiet in her chest, began to beat louder, though she did not know why. She reached down and lifted the rose, her fingers curling slowly around the stem. She held it close, her breath catching in her throat. There was no dramatic gesture, no declaration, but in that single act, in the silence of it, in the absence of demand, something cracked. Not completely, just enough. She brought the rose to her chest, cradled it there as she sat on the edge of the bed. And for the first time in many years, Genevieve Sinclair felt something shift behind the wall she had built. Not love, not forgiveness, but the first ache of something unspoken, waiting. The storm arrived with little warning. By twilight, the air had grown dense and breathless, the city pressing in under a sky of lead. Heavy clouds coiled over Philadelphia's rooftops, darkening the skyline with ominous intent. When the first crack of thunder split the heavens, the Sinclair mansion shuddered slightly, as if the walls themselves had memories of storms long past. Genevieve stood near the parlor window, watching the rain sheet across the garden in silver slants. Lightning lit the sky in a jagged vein of white, illuminating the bare branches of the trees and the wrought-iron fence that encircled them like a crown of thorns. Behind her, the lamps flickered once, twice, then died. All at once, the house was plunged into silence and shadow. In the corridor beyond, servants murmured and hurried to fetch candles. Clara's soft voice could be heard calling for Ruth. Footsteps echoed faintly across the marble floors. But Genevieve did not move. The storm pulsed against the windows, as if trying to reach her. The fire in the parlor had begun to fade, leaving the room in a dim amber glow. She reached for the velvet curtain, closed it slowly, and turned toward the hallway. In moments such as this, when nature roared and civility dimmed, truths had a way of rising to the surface. She made her way toward the library. It was there that she found him. Edward stood near the hearth, one hand resting on the mantel, the other clutching a decanter of brandy. His coat had been removed, his collar loosened, and his hair, usually so precisely combed, was slightly mussed, as if he'd run his fingers through it more than once. He turned as she entered, his expression unreadable. "No light in the whole house," he said. "The servants are scrambling." She nodded, walking past him toward the far window, which was now completely black with rain. "I suppose it's fitting," she said softly. "Storm outside, storm within." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though it lacked all amusement. "I thought you preferred silence." "I've grown used to it," she replied. "That is not the same thing." He poured a second glass and held it out to her. She hesitated, then took it, their fingers brushing, just barely. She moved to sit in the armchair nearest the fire, the small flames casting shadows across the dark mahogany paneling. Edward remained standing, but his posture had softened. The wind howled outside like something alive. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. He looked at her. "Regret what?" "This." She gestured vaguely with her glass. "The arrangement. The choice." His eyes flickered. "I regret needing it," he said at last. "I regret that pride and desperation are such close cousins." She looked into the fire, the glass cold in her palm. "I regret believing my name could shield me from humiliation," she murmured, "that wealth would make me immune to loneliness." He said nothing. The silence between them thickened, not uncomfortable, but weighty, fragile. "I read your name in society columns long before I ever met you," she said after a pause. "You were always surrounded, always smiling. I imagined you were untouchable." He gave a bitter smile. My family was once proud. My father believed appearances were all that mattered. He died before he saw how wrong he was. And your mother grieved in silence, as women are taught to do. Genevieve's gaze did not move from the fire. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. My husband had a mistress. Edward froze. He kept a house for her just outside of Chestnut Hill. He told me once that he admired loyalty more than anything, and all the while... She trailed off, then inhaled sharply. He left me no children, no affection, only property, paperwork, and a name to protect. Edward sat slowly in the chair opposite her. The fire crackled between them, a flickering witness to every truth unspoken until now. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it. She looked at him then, truly looked. There was no mockery in his eyes, no arrogance, only a quiet sadness that mirrored her own. You must think me cold, she said, distant, but I am only a woman who has learned to survive without being seen. He leaned forward, his voice low. And I am a man who's spent years pretending he didn't care how far he'd fallen, until you gave me shelter, and I hated you for it. Genevieve swallowed hard. Her chest ached, not from pain, but from the unspoken weight that had been lifted, if only slightly. Do you still hate me? She asked. He did not answer. Instead, he reached across the space between them, his hand resting on the arm of her chair. His fingers hovered close to hers, not quite touching. She looked down, then up, her breath unsteady, and in that moment, something passed between them. Something that had nothing to do with contracts or names or debts. Something quiet, fragile, real. He leaned closer, slowly, as if asking permission with each breath. She did not pull away. Their faces were inches apart now, the fire reflecting in both their eyes. His hand brushed hers, lightly. Her lips parted, not in invitation but in vulnerability. It was not desire that pulled them together. It was recognition. A near kiss, soft, hesitant, on the edge of trembling surrender. But just as their mouths almost met, the door creaked open. A servant stepped in, carrying 2 candlesticks. Forgive me, sir, ma'am. The lamps are restored. Genevieve turned sharply, sitting upright. Edward stood at once, his composure returning like armor. The moment shattered like thin porcelain. The servant placed the candles on the table, bowed, and exited. Genevieve smoothed the folds of her skirt with trembling hands. Edward reached for the brandy, then thought better of it. He looked at her, his jaw tight. I should check on Clara. She nodded, unable to find her voice. He left, without another word. When the door closed, she pressed her hand to her chest, the skin still warm where his breath had hovered. Outside, the storm began to wane, but inside the library the air still crackled, not with thunder, but with the memory of almost, of nearly, of something that had not yet taken form, but no longer slept. The first thaw of late winter came not with sunshine, but with a strange stillness in the air, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The snow along Chestnut Street had begun to melt into thin rivulets that trickled into the gutters, carrying with them the soot and silence of a season too long endured. Inside the Sinclair mansion, however, no such thaw had reached the hearts of those who lived within. Edward Hale had not spoken more than a few polite words to Genevieve since the storm. The memory of near touch, near truth, near surrender hung between them like the scent of a fading rose, sweet, elusive, and impossible to ignore. They passed one another in hallways, in drawing rooms, in the quiet of shared dinners where words failed and glances said too much. It was in that fragile space that Charles Whitman re-emerged. Edward met him on a Thursday afternoon at the Merchants' Club. The snow had turned to slush beneath the boots of men who no longer noticed the cold, too consumed by commerce and calculation. Whitman was waiting in a private chamber, dressed in his usual arrogance, a dark green waistcoat embroidered with gold thread, a gold pocket watch glinting against the brocade. "You're late," he said, without looking up from the newspaper he held. Edward closed the door behind him. "I nearly didn't come. And yet, here you are. Whitman gestured to the chair across from him. Edward sat, his posture stiff, his expression carved from granite. "I'll be brief," Whitman said. "The Hale family's debts have grown teeth. 3 creditors approached me last week. They intend to file formal charges if restitution is not made by the end of the month." Edward's jaw tightened. "That's not news to me." Whitman leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "I can erase those debts entirely. Your father's name, clean. Your family, restored. Clara, protected." Edward narrowed his eyes. "And in return, a small price," Whitman replied with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "You divorce Mrs. Sinclair, publicly, on the grounds of financial misrepresentation and moral instability. And then," he reached into his coat and produced a slender leather folder. "You sign this. It grants me access to her estate ledgers, board correspondence, and mill production schedules." Edward didn't touch the folder. "You want to dismantle her," he said slowly. "No," Whitman replied smoothly. "I want to acquire what she refuses to share. There's a difference, and you need me to betray her to do it." Whitman sat back, sipping from a crystal tumbler of brandy. "Let's not pretend she's innocent, Edward. She bought you. You've already sold your pride. Why not at least redeem your family in the process?" Edward rose slowly. "If I take this and walk out that door, there's no turning back." Whitman met his gaze evenly. "Think carefully. You've lived in her house, eaten her food, worn her money like a coat over your shame. How long can you pretend that's not a prison?" Edward said nothing. He stared at the folder for a long moment, then turned and left without a word. But he did not leave it behind. That evening, Genevieve sat alone in her study. The lamps were lit low, casting amber light across the rows of books and stacks of ledgers. A letter had arrived that morning, unsigned, hand-delivered, containing a copy of a document bearing her signature. Only she had never signed it. It was a contract granting oversight access to Whitman and Company regarding the future holdings of the Sinclair Textile Group. A forgery, a near-perfect one. She stared at it, her fingertips cold despite the heat of the fire. There was no doubt in her mind who had forged it, but the question that twisted in her chest, sharp and cruel, was simpler. Had Edward helped him? She stood and walked to the sideboard where a silver tea service had been laid out hours before. She poured a cup with steady hands, then added 2 cubes of sugar, though she would not drink it. The door creaked open. Edward entered, his face unreadable, his coat dusted with the remnants of melting snow. She turned without surprise. "You were out late." He removed his gloves slowly. "Business in the city." She nodded once, then walked past him to the window. "Tell me something, Mr. Hale," she said without turning. "Do you believe loyalty is ever worth more than legacy?" He hesitated. "That depends on the cost." Her eyes flickered unseen. "And what if the price was someone else's ruin?" He crossed the room slowly. "Is this a riddle, Genevieve?" "No," she replied, still watching the street beyond the glass. "It's a test." He said nothing. She turned then, facing him with eyes that had turned cold steel. "There are many things I tolerate in this house," she said softly, "but betrayal is not one of them." Their eyes locked. He didn't flinch, but he didn't answer. Genevieve inclined her head almost in mock politeness. "Good night, Mr. Hale." She walked past him, calm as glass. Only when she reached the threshold did she allow herself to breathe. She did not know if he had taken the offer, but he had not denied it, and silence, she knew too well, could wound more deeply than any truth. That night, in her private quarters, she summoned Ruth and gave instructions to prepare the blue velvet portfolio kept locked in the library desk, the one containing deeds, legal filings, and defensive contracts never meant to see the light of day. She did not weep, she did not rage, but behind her stillness something long dormant stirred awake. She would not be destroyed by another man's cowardice, not again. And if Edward Hale thought her a woman easy to deceive, he would soon learn that no storm is more dangerous than a woman who has lost faith and chosen war. The air inside the boardroom of the Sinclair Holding Company was stifling, though the fire burned low and the lamps were turned down to their brass bases. Outside, the city was waking to another cold February morning, unaware that inside this tall building on Walnut Street, the legacy of a woman was being placed on trial without due process. The long mahogany table stretched through the center of the room like a battlefield. Around it sat 11 men, all in varying shades of grey and black, their collars starched, their expressions stern. At the head of the table sat Genevieve Sinclair Hale, her back straight, her eyes dry, her composure undisturbed, but beneath the surface her pulse thundered like a warning bell. To her left was Mr. Ferris, the most senior member of the board. Beside him, the youngest member, Mr. Aldridge, refused to meet her gaze. Charles Whitman stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, the shadow of a smirk on his mouth. He was the one who had called this meeting. He was the one who had placed forged financial statements in the hands of the board. He was the one who had accused her publicly of embezzlement. The word itself echoed in her ears, cold and absurd. It was not only a lie, it was an act of war. Mrs. Hale, Ferris began, folding his hands before him, we have no choice but to address the documentation brought to our attention. If proven valid, it would imply a gross mismanagement of funds on your part, and possibly criminal activity. Genevieve said nothing. She merely tilted her head slightly, waiting. Whitman stepped forward, playing his role with the elegance of a man used to maneuvering power like a violin bow. I take no pleasure in bringing this to the table, he said smoothly. But I have a duty to the investors, to the workers, to the integrity of the company. Personal feelings aside, we must consider what's best for Sinclair Holdings. Genevieve's voice, when it came, was calm and deliberate. And you believe what's best is removing me? Whitman shrugged. What I believe is irrelevant. The numbers speak for themselves. Her gaze swept the room. Most of the men avoided her eyes. Cowards, all of them. But then the door opened. Edward entered. He was dressed in a dark blue frock coat, a navy cravat tied precisely, his expression unreadable. He held a folder in one hand, his gloves in the other. His entrance stirred something in the room, not panic, but disruption, as if the wind had shifted and no one yet knew why. Apologies, he said to no one in particular. I believe I have something that may interest the board. Whitman scoffed. You are not a board member, Hale. No, Edward replied, stepping toward the table. But as the legal husband of Mrs. Hale, I do hold certain rights, including the right to speak in her defense. Ferris hesitated. Go on. Edward opened the folder and began to place several letters on the table. Real letters, originals, each signed and sealed by Whitman's former associates. Letters of correspondence, letters of instruction, letters that spoke of manipulation, of sabotage, of an effort to drive Genevieve into disrepute so Whitman could position himself for a buyout. I have here written and signed communications from 3 individuals, Edward said, his voice steady but sharp, confirming Mr. Whitman's attempts to coerce them into falsifying documents, including balance sheets and warehouse reports. Whitman turned pale. Those are forgeries. No, Edward said, raising his voice for the first time. Those are the truth, unlike the poison you've been feeding this board. A stunned silence followed. Genevieve looked at Edward, truly looked, and for the first time in many months, she saw the man, not the burden, not the pride, but the man who stood when it counted. Ferris cleared his throat. If these documents are verified, they are, Edward cut in, and I am prepared to swear as much in court, regardless of what it may cost me personally. Genevieve's breath caught. There it was. The gesture that stripped him of all defense, of all calculation. He was willing to risk his own name for hers. Mr. Aldridge looked up, the first to speak with certainty. I move that we strike Whitman's claims from the record and begin a full investigation into his conduct. Ferris nodded slowly. All in favor. Hands went up. All but one. Whitman turned on his heel and stormed from the room. The meeting was adjourned. The men began to file out, murmuring, stealing glances at Genevieve with a mix of awe and shame. Edward remained where he stood, the folder now closed, his gloves forgotten on the table. Genevieve rose slowly. She walked to him, not rushing, not floating, simply walking like a woman who had survived a battlefield and now stood before its most unlikely soldier. She reached for his hand and held it, not as a gesture of victory nor of gratitude, but of something unspoken, something fragile and unfamiliar. He looked down at their joined hands, his eyes flickering with emotion he did not voice. They left the building together, but the silence between them lingered even after the carriage brought them home. Inside the mansion, Ruth met them at the door, her eyes wide with relief. Clara came running down the stairs, throwing her arms around Genevieve without a word. Genevieve returned the embrace gently, her eyes never leaving Edward's face. Later, in the solitude of her sitting room, Genevieve stood by the window, staring out at the dusk settling over the city. Her hand still tingled from where his had held it. She wanted to knock on his door, to ask him why he did it, to ask if it had been for duty, or something closer to devotion, but she did not move, because war had taught her one thing above all else. Even love must wait its turn when wounds are still fresh. The morning sky over Philadelphia was washed in the pale grey of farewell. A hesitant sun pushed through the thinning winter clouds, casting a cold, indifferent light across the city. Inside the Sinclair mansion, the air held a strange stillness, one that no fire could dispel and no voice dared to interrupt. Edward Hale stood in the corner of his study, a small leather satchel resting on the edge of the desk, half-packed. Papers lay stacked with measured precision beside a worn black travel coat, its seams still damp from a recent pressing. A train ticket to Boston, folded neatly, peeked from the breast pocket. He reached for it, paused, and exhaled. There had been no argument, no great declaration, just silence. And that silence, heavy and unyielding, had made the decision for him. After all he had done, for her, for Clara, for the company, he still did not belong. He had crossed a line in the boardroom, not just to defend her name, but to find his own. But even in that moment of shared triumph, Genevieve's eyes had remained distant, like someone watching the horizon for a ship that would never return. She had taken his hand, and then she had let it go. Now he would go as well. He heard footsteps in the corridor. A soft knock followed, too light to be Ruth, too hesitant to be Clara. He didn't answer. The door opened anyway. Genevieve stepped inside. She was dressed in a simple navy blue walking dress with a velvet sash cinched high at the waist. Her hair was pinned back, though a single curl had come loose and framed her cheek. She did not wear gloves, and in her bare hand she carried nothing, no defense, no pretense. He turned slowly, the ticket still in his hand. "So," she said softly, "you're leaving." He nodded. "There's business in Boston, an opportunity I've delayed too long." Her eyes searched his face, and for a moment the silence between them stretched taut. "Is that the only reason?" He looked down. "No." She stepped forward, each movement measured, each breath an act of control. "I suppose I should thank you," she said, "for what you did at the board meeting. You saved my name." "I didn't do it for your name," he replied. She paused. "Then for what?" He met her gaze, and for once, nothing in his eyes was guarded. "For you." A silence settled. "I didn't ask you to," she said, but her voice trembled at the edges. "No," he said. "You never ask for anything." She lowered her gaze. Edward turned back to the desk, picked up his gloves. "I think," he said, more to the window than to her, "you deserve someone who gives without condition, someone who didn't arrive in your life through necessity, someone you could choose, freely." He began buttoning his coat. Behind him, her voice came, quiet but steady. "Then stay." He froze. "Not for debt." Not for appearances, not because you think you owe me. Slowly he turned. Stay because I want you. Her voice broke slightly on the last word, and for the first time since the day of their cold, silent wedding, Genevieve Sinclair allowed the armor to crack. He crossed the room slowly. Her breath caught as he approached, but she did not retreat. He lifted his hand, gently brushing that stray curl from her cheek. His fingers lingered at her temple, tracing the line of her face with the reverence of a man touching something sacred. "You want me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded. His hand slid behind her neck, his palm warm against her skin. "And not for duty?" "No." He leaned in so slowly it was almost painful. "And not for power?" She shook her head, breathless. "No." When his lips touched hers, it was not in haste or hunger, but in something far more dangerous: sincerity. It was a kiss that asked for nothing and gave everything, a kiss that undid the vow of silence, born not from law, but from fear. Genevieve's hands rose to his chest, not to push him away, but to steady herself. The room around them faded. No marble, no portraits, no ticking clocks, only the weight of his mouth on hers, the warmth of his breath, the tremble in her fingertips. When they parted, neither spoke. Words would only cheapen the moment. Later, the house grew quiet. Ruth had retired early. The lamps in the hall dimmed to a soft glow. Clara's light was out, the door to her chamber gently closed. Genevieve stood outside Edward's room. She had changed into her nightgown, a pale silk that caught the light like moonlit water. A shawl draped around her shoulders, clasped with trembling hands. She raised her hand to knock, then stopped. The door opened before she could touch it. Edward stood there, no coat, no waistcoat. His shirt sleeves were rolled to his forearms, his expression bare. "I wasn't sure you would come," he said. "I wasn't sure either," she replied. He stepped aside. She entered without another word. He closed the door behind her. They did not speak as he led her to the bed. He did not undress her. He did not ask for more than what she had already given. She lay beside him, her head resting against his chest. He pulled the covers over them both, his arm drawing her near, their bodies fitting together, not in longing, but in belonging. The fire in the hearth flickered low. In the stillness, she felt his heartbeat beneath her ear. Strong, steady, real. His hand found hers beneath the blanket, and there, in the quiet of a marriage long denied its truth, they slept, clothed, untouched, and more intimate than they had ever been. A man who had been bought had given himself freely. A woman who had never been asked had finally been chosen. Outside, the last of the winter snow fell gently across the city. Inside, two hearts, once strangers in silence, now rested in something deeper than love: trust. Spring arrived in Philadelphia, not with a burst of color, but with the quiet confidence of a city that had endured much and continued forward with grace. The streets were cleaner, the sky clearer, and the grand houses of Rittenhouse Square once more opened their windows to the warming breeze. Within the gates of the Sinclair estate, the gardens bloomed in well-disciplined symmetry: tulips in straight rows, lilacs climbing trellises, and magnolia trees bowing under their own beauty. The mansion, too, had softened. The sharp silence that once ruled its halls had been replaced with music, conversation, and the occasional sound of laughter echoing faintly across the marble floors. Genevieve had opened the house again, not to the city, but to life. It had been nearly 3 months since the winter ended, in more ways than one. Tonight, the Sinclair name would shine not in defense, not in scandal, but in celebration. The ballroom, once sealed in widow's quiet, was alight with chandeliers. Musicians tuned their instruments in the far corner as uniformed servers adjusted the crystal flutes on long white linen tables. The soft clink of glass, the scent of fresh flowers, and the rustle of silk gowns created a harmony of anticipation. The gala was to mark the relaunch of Sinclair Textiles, now formally restructured under Genevieve's name, with written commitments to labor reform. It was the first industrial contract in Philadelphia to guarantee housing for mill girls, reasonable hours, and inspections by independent overseers. It was not charity. It was change. Genevieve stood at the top of the grand staircase, surveying the final preparations. Her gown was midnight blue, cut in velvet, with delicate black beading across the sleeves and bodice. Her hair was gathered at the crown of her head, in a soft chignon, with a sapphire comb nestled behind her ear. She wore no necklace. She needed none. Edward stood behind her, his cravat impeccably tied, the deep charcoal of his evening coat perfectly fitted. He did not speak, but when she turned to meet his gaze, he nodded once. The look they exchanged was not of rehearsed coordination, but of mutual readiness. Downstairs, the guests had begun to arrive. Carriages lined the street, and Philadelphia's most powerful stepped across the marble threshold with admiration and perhaps a touch of envy. Among them, Helena Mercer made her entrance with her usual theatrical flair, a dark gown of crimson taffeta and a feathered fan in hand. Her eyes scanned the room like a queen returning to court. She accepted a glass of champagne from a footman and moved toward the staircase just as Genevieve descended. The two women met at the center of the ballroom, drawing the attention of many. Helena looked Genevieve up and down, a half-smile on her lips. "Well," she said with a raised brow, "I was told you would never recover your standing." Genevieve met her gaze, serene. "You were told many things, Helena." Helena's fan paused mid-flutter. She tilted her head and, after a beat, her expression softened, if only slightly. "You've done more than recover. You've rewritten the rules." Genevieve blinked, surprised. "That was a compliment, dear," Helena added with a smirk. "Don't let it go to your head." "I won't," Genevieve replied. "But thank you." Helena leaned in, her voice low. "And for what it's worth, I was wrong about him." Genevieve said nothing, but her heart beat faster. She moved through the room, greeting each guest with quiet grace. There was no arrogance in her bearing, only calm authority. The name Sinclair now carried with it more than wealth. It carried justice. Clara stood by the tall French doors leading to the garden, dressed in soft green satin, her cheeks flushed with color and confidence. She had found a place in this house, and more importantly, a voice. Several ladies gathered around her, listening with interest as she described a new education initiative she was organizing for the factory workers' children. Genevieve paused to watch her for a moment, pride tugging gently at her chest. From across the room, Edward approached. "I believe," he said as he reached her side, "that you've started a revolution." She gave a quiet smile. "One stitch at a time. Your board has asked that you name a partner," he added after a pause. "I've read the letters," she said. "They're offering me the seat." "They're offering it," she corrected, "because you earned it." He looked at her. "But I won't sign it," she continued, "unless you agree to the terms." "What terms?" "That we build something that belongs to both of us. Not just in name, but in truth." His expression did not change immediately. He looked down, then back into her eyes. "And what would that require of me?" "Everything," she whispered, "and nothing more than what you've already given." The music began, a gentle waltz. Edward extended his hand. "May I?" She placed hers in his, the warmth of his touch anchoring her in the moment. They moved together onto the floor. The room shifted, guests parting, making space without being asked. They danced slowly, deliberately. No performance, no spectacle. Only two people moving as one. Her fingers rested lightly against his shoulder, his hand pressed firmly at her waist. Their steps were unhurried, their gazes locked. He leaned in, his voice barely audible beneath the violins. This time he said, "I choose you, not for wealth, not for legacy, just for you." She stopped just for a moment, breath catching. Then she smiled. "And I choose you." The chandelier overhead reflected in her eyes like stars fallen to earth. Around them, the gala continued. Conversations, laughter, the clink of glass, but in the heart of it all stood the quiet miracle of a marriage no longer forged from need, but chosen freely, fiercely, and without shame. The night stretched on, and the Sinclair name sparkled not from opulence, but from the strength of a woman who had risen from silence, from the devotion of a man who had learned to kneel before no one, and from the love they had not expected, but finally embraced. And for the first time, the house felt not like a fortress, but like a home. Philadelphia, spring of 1883. The Sinclair estate stood unchanged to the untrained eye. Its tall iron gate still flanked by climbing roses, its marble facade still pristine against the morning sun. But to those who had lived within its walls, the house had become something far more than a symbol of wealth or survival. It had become a sanctuary for resilience and for love. In the garden, where the lilacs now bloomed in unhurried splendor, two children ran barefoot through the dewy grass. The boy, dark-haired and wild with laughter, chased his sister, who clutched a stolen scone in her small hands, her curls bouncing as she fled. Their shouts echoed across the courtyard, the melody of a home long healed. Genevieve stood at the parlor window, watching them with quiet eyes. The years had graced her gently. A few strands of silver shimmered through her chestnut hair, and fine lines softened the corners of her eyes, but she wore them with the dignity of a life lived fully, fiercely. Her hands, once always gloved, always poised, now bore the marks of motherhood. Ink stains from lessons taught at the writing desk, and a thin scar on her thumb from a kitchen mishap she refused to let the staff correct. Behind her, Edward entered the room carrying a bundle of correspondence. "They've approved the second mill in Harrisburg," he said, "under your name. Again." Genevieve turned, a soft smile on her lips. "I told them the credit should be shared." "You did," he replied, crossing to her. "And they ignored you. Again." She touched his cheek briefly, affection no longer an act of hesitation. Their marriage had not softened with time. It had deepened. Seasoned by shared burdens and quiet triumphs, by late-night arguments over Clara's engagement and tearful laughter when their daughter was born during a snowstorm, neither of them had expected. Theirs was not the romance of stolen glances anymore. It was the solid, quiet anchor of chosen devotion. Edward kissed her forehead gently, then turned to watch the children through the glass. "Do you ever miss the quiet?" he asked. Genevieve chuckled. "Desperately, but not enough to give them back." They stood like that for a while, two souls who had once been strangers in the same house, now sharing one breath. Clara arrived shortly after noon, escorted by her husband, a progressive young councilman who had grown up in the very orphan initiative she had helped create. Her belly was round with her second child, and her eyes lit up the room the moment she entered. "Genevieve," she beamed, "he kicks every time we pass the statue on Chestnut. I think he already hates Whitman." Edward let out a low laugh, but Genevieve's expression shifted, just slightly. Charles Whitman had fallen hard and fast after the scandal. Though he avoided prison, he was stripped of every title and influence he had clung to. He died in a boarding house on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, far from the city he once ruled in whispers. His name, now mentioned only in cautionary tales, had become synonymous with ambition without soul. "Let him be forgotten," Genevieve said softly. Clara nodded. "He already is." That evening, as twilight settled over the estate, the family gathered under the veranda. The children sat at their parents' feet, listening to a story about a girl who had once ruled a house of marble with nothing but her name and her silence. A girl who had learned that silence was not strength, that love, when chosen freely, was the only legacy that mattered. As the stars began to pierce the velvet sky, Genevieve leaned against Edward's shoulder. 10 years, she whispered. He laced his fingers through hers. "And I would choose you again, every time." She closed her eyes, the sound of their children's laughter drifting like wind through leaves. No longer a widow, no longer a stranger, no longer alone. Genevieve Sinclair Hale had once struck a bargain in the cold of winter, believing she was buying peace. Instead, she had purchased the key to a love that would survive scandal, silence, and time itself. And in the quiet warmth of that spring night, she knew this was her greatest fortune. In a world where power often disguises itself as love and duty can masquerade as devotion, Genevieve and Edward showed us something rare and unforgettable, that the truest bonds are not forged in convenience, but in the quiet, deliberate act of choosing each other every single day. Their journey wasn't one of fairy tales. It was built through silence, storms, and the pain of learning to trust after betrayal. And yet, through all of it, love emerged, not grandiose, not perfect, but real, enduring, deeply earned. If this story touched your heart, if you too believe that love is stronger when it grows from hardship, I invite you to type the word "chosen" in the comments. That way I'll know you stayed with us until the very end, and together we'll help this little corner of emotional, historical storytelling reach more hearts around the world. Share this video with a friend, a sister, your mother, or anyone who still believes in the kind of love that takes its time but never lets go. And if you crave more stirring romances like this one, don't forget to check the suggested videos I've left in the cards. Each one carries its own world of longing, resilience, and unforgettable passion. Thank you for watching, and remembering that sometimes the greatest love stories are the ones we almost walked away from.